everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week's episode is our Wilds of Eldraine gameplay level up episode. So I do these gameplay level up episodes once per set, and they act as a really good vehicle to talk about one of the topics that limited content generally doesn't get to talk about, and that's good gameplay and how to level up your gameplay, get better at it. It's half the battle, really. It's just much easier in limited content generally to talk about the best archetypes and the best cards. Gameplay can be kind of tricky to talk about since every game is different and it gets a little bit abstract. So I want to try to solve that on these episodes a little bit. I try to make these episodes as practical as I possibly can. I tend to talk about some big picture thoughts, some things that are going through my head as I'm playing out the games. I like to talk about ways to frame the games in this format so you can kind of better understand the game that you're playing. And I like to go pretty deep on specific cards, not only just some tricky to play cards and talking about some tips and tricks, but really just talking about why you would want a card and what role it plays in your deck. And as a listener, I think listening to that really helps uncover some leaks that you have concerning, where you're using certain cards or how you're using them, or maybe just thinking about how to use a specific card a little bit better in game. So yeah, that's what we have going on today. Like most episodes, these gameplay episodes tend to be pretty jam-packed, so let's get into it. And just before we do, a very quick shout out to the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelup. So you can go there if you like the show, if you want to support, if you want to give back. A bunch of reward tiers over there that we want to give back to you if you choose to support. Those reward tiers are all focused on getting you better at limited magic in some way. So if you're interested in leveling up your limited game or supporting the podcast, go check it out. Okay, so I want to start just with a little bit of a view into the future, what's on the docket for today. I mentioned in our intro that I like to talk about big picture ideas as well as individual cards to get a kind of holistic sense of the gameplay in this format. And usually I do that in about a half and half split for these episodes. But for this format, I've actually decided to take a bit of a different approach, a few fewer big picture overarching thoughts, and a little bit more talking about individual cards. And specifically, the reason why I'm doing this is because I think there are a lot of decks in this format that play out quite differently. In some formats, I can say, 90% of the decks kind of play out the same general game plan. Something like Phyrexian will be one. It's like, yeah, you kind of just want to be attacking, and here's how to do it. I think there are enough different kind of archetypes in this format between blue control and red aggro and green ramp that instead of big picture tips for the format as a whole, I don't have as many of those, but I still have a few. I'm going to break down each of those big buckets of archetypes. And then within those archetypes, I have four main ones I want to talk about today. We'll be talking about how to play those archetypes and also some key cards, specific cards in those decks, getting to talk bit more granular. And again, the reason I'm doing this is because the gameplay in this format is pretty modular. You should be thinking about playing your game differently based on what deck you're playing, basically. The advice here is not just going to be cut and dry throughout all the decks, which is a really nice thing about the format, by the way. It's a testament to the fact that there are a lot of viable types of ways to play this format, and that's just not true for every format. All right, so like I said, a little bit light on the big picture points, but I do have one to kick us off, and that is a tip that I think that you can apply to any deck that you're drafting, any deck that you're playing against, and that is to keep asking yourself as consistently and often as you can, what open mana does my opponent have, and what could that mean? And you should be asking that pretty much anytime the opponent has open mana, whether that be when they go for an attack or when they pass their turn. But I think it's a really important question to ask yourself in this format particularly. It is a question you should be asking yourself in all formats at all times. It's just one of those things that's good to have at the back of your head. But a feature of this format is people will be passing the turn with all or some of their mana up a little more often than they would in another format. Part of that is because there's good combat tricks, but there's also good interaction with Candy Grapple and Torch the Tower and Rat Out and Flick a Coin. Adventure creatures add to this count, of course, because you have a creature, and usually in most sets, creatures are just creatures, but in this set, creatures are also spells. In some formats, you just find, I mentioned Phyrexian will be one, you find people just tap out most of the time. They tap out to play their 2, and then their 3, and then their 4, and then maybe they'll, as the game goes on, hold up some mana. But I found in this format, especially when you're not facing an aggressive deck, and even sometimes when you are, your opponents will rarely be doing that kind of play pattern where they just go like tap out, tap out, tap out. Usually it'll be like, play a 2-drop, and then maybe play another 2 and hold up a Rat Out, or play a 2-drop and 4 and hold up a Candy Grapple, something like that. There's just a lot of different ways you can be spending your mana, and a lot of cheap different ways to be spending your mana. So you tend to be able to play an instant speed game a little more often, even if you're not a blue deck, right? Even if you're just like a black deck or even some red deck. And why I think it's so important to keep asking yourself this question is if you're not asking yourself this question, you're gonna feel like you're getting blown out of the water a lot of the time. Your opponent has the removal spell at the right time, or has the combat trick that really gets you, or casts Flick a Coin on your X1 creature at a really pivotal point in the game. And these are somewhat avoidable if you can anticipate them and kind of suss out what your opponent's hand is, right? My goal when I'm playing a game in this format is to sort of deduce the cards that might be in my opponent's hand if they're leaving up mana, or just in general. And that deduction comes from both what I think they might have, if they're leaving up 2 mana, one of them being black for a few turns, okay, they might be looking for a good place to use a Candy Grapple, but also what they don't have, right, or what they're not playing. If I play a really good creature on turn 4, my opponent doesn't remove it right away, well, I'm pretty sure they don't have a hard removal spell. Or if I dangle a really juicy target for a Rat Out, like a Stingblade Assassin, 4 mana, 3/1, and they don't cast a Flick a Coin or Rat Out, well, I'm pretty sure they don't have those. Have I given my opponent a good opportunity to use a combat trick? Well, if not, it's raising the chances they might have one because I haven't given them an opportunity where I've blocked. So it's kind of that kind of reasoning. So if you're a player who isn't thinking of this at all, like, you're not in the level just yet of thinking what my opponent could have in their hand, well, I would start thinking about it. I wouldn't just, I wouldn't wait until some future date to be like, well, when I'm better at Magic, I can start thinking about it. This is how you get better, honestly. Like this, I believe that if there is one skill that pro players and the best players in the world do better than, the rest of the people, basically, it's that they have a good sense of what's in the opponent's hand generally. And that just lets them make better plays. They can almost, if your opponent's hand was face up during a game of Magic, it would be a lot easier. And the best players, based on both what your opponent is doing and what the opponent isn't doing, are going to be able to suss roughly what your opponent might have in hand. And even for the players who have been playing a long time, I would say this is a really good format to kind of flex that skill a little bit more. I think sometimes when we're playing and you go, okay, the opponent has some open mana, but like, I'm not exactly sure what it is. I'm just going to, play my cards. You understand that they might do something. I would really push it a little bit and just say, okay, exactly what could they have? Like, really put them on a range of 3 cards or something and best play around those. Because that's an edge you can gain, right? I think a lot of people kind of give up that edge by just going, okay, they could have something, but I'm not exactly sure what. Really, if you like, sometimes it's obvious that it's just 1 or 2 things, right? It's 1 of 2 things that they could possibly have because the mana they have open couldn't be anything else. But then sometimes, like I mentioned before, you can narrow down to 1 thing because, well, one of those things was a Rat Out and they would have cast it earlier. So instead, it might be Not Dead After All, for example, right? Or an Arena, of course, gives you even more of a push because, like, well, it gives you that pause if there's a black mana. So I think if you're struggling, and especially if you do feel like you're getting blown out a lot, this is probably just a skill you have to develop a little bit more. And the reason why I'm starting with this big picture point is some folks in my Discord, when I asked, hey, what do you want to hear about this week? We're doing the gameplay episode. It was a lot of people saying, I feel there's a key moment in most of my games where I get blown out somehow. Either my opponent had that combat trick at the right time or the interaction spell. And, sometimes you get blown out in situations that you can't help, right? You're just playing your game. You understand the opponent could have X, Y, Z, but you can't really play around it. But I do think there are a good number of games where it's like, yeah, you shouldn't have played that adventure into that open mana because it was pretty likely your opponent had a removal spell. They hadn't cast one earlier this game. You hadn't given them a good chance to. And yeah, you got blown out because you weren't thinking about it. So that's the point I want to hammer home. Your opponents are going to be passing the turn with most or some of their mana up more often than in other formats. Ask yourself what that means. When you're planning out your turns, make sure that your plays account for the potential of your opponent casting a spell. You want to set yourself up for success. You don't want to set yourself up for blowouts. And we're going to move into some examples. This is a little bit, fluffy, but I do want to give some salient examples, some games that I actually played in the last few days. All right, so this first situation is from a game that I played just yesterday. As always, for those just listening, I'm going to do my best to describe what's happening here. But for those watching along on YouTube, you're going to get the nice, shiny gameplay graphics here. So I've got a really good red-white aggro deck. It's turn 3, and just to give you some context of how this game's played out, I played a Embereth Veteran, the 1-mana 2/1. The opponent played a Hopeful Vigil on turn 2. Those traded off. And then after those traded off on my turn 2, I played an Ash Party Crasher after combat because I didn't want to trade the 2/2 Ash for the 2/2 token. So I just kind of played it and sat there and passed the turn. We're now at a game state where it is turn 3. The opponent has passed. They have planes in turn, and that Hopeful Vigil, just the enchantment sitting on the battlefield. I cast Witch's Mark for the turn, discarding a card, putting the roll on Ash, and in hand I have a Ratcatcher Trainee, a Minecart Daredevil, a Besotted Knight, a Grand Ball Guest, and a Plains. So I can't really do that much else this turn. And I'm faced with a decision here. Well, number one, I'm asking myself, okay, what is my opponent's open mana representing? It could just be that they're mana screwed because they have just plains. I think it's very reasonable to assume that the opponent just wanted to pass the turn here and crack their Vigil so that they could scry into their lands that I thought they might be missing. As it turns out, the opponent actually was a mono white or close to mono white deck, so that wasn't what was happening here. But even still, I thought to myself, okay, what could the opponent have for their open white mana here that I'm trying to play around? And of course, if you played any of this format, Kellen's Lightblades probably comes to mind. It's the 2 mana, deal 3 to an attacker or a blocker, but if you've bargained it, you just kill the creature. And that's certainly a card I'm thinking about here. And so this whole idea of figuring out what your opponent has, asking yourself what the open mana could represent, it's twofold. Well, number one, it's figuring out the cards they could actually have. So, like I said, Lightblades, I suppose they could also have the Werefox Bodyguard, the rare kind of Banisher, Priest, Brutal Cathar sort of creature, but I can't really play around that. So I'm mostly just thinking Lightblades. So if Lightblades is a possibility here, what should I do about that is the next question. Well, one, I think, what if I just play into it? What if I just attack with my Ash here and they get to Lightblades? That's pretty bad, I think. Not only does it kill my 2-drop, which really takes a lot of steam out of my aggro deck, but they're killing one of my better creatures too. And of course, the big thing is I can just wait a turn here because I can grow Ash out of the range of the deal 3. They can, of course, then sack Hopeful Vigil, but that's still a cost, right? Them having to sack Hopeful Vigil, getting rid of something they can bargain or pick up with a stockpile like Celebrant or whatever, like, that's still somewhat of a cost. It is much worse for them to bargain next turn, or play the Lightblades next turn needing to bargain, than it is just doing it now when they were just going to crack their Vigil anyways, potentially. And also it wastes their mana, too. A big thing with a card like Kellen's Lightblades is your opponent plays around it in a way where they just you just can't cast it if they don't attack. And I think it's totally fine in this position for me to just say, okay, well, number one, I can grow this Ash out of range next turn to make them bargain away the Vigil. Number two, I could just play out my board, not play into it. And if they're not playing anything, then great, I get to kind of just build out my board and they're not doing anything. That's a totally fine way to play around it. I had some folks asking, well, why not just attack here? They're going to have the Lightblades anyways. Isn't it just good to get it out of their hand? It is a 1-for-1 exchange for sure. But if I allow them to spend mana on this turn here, on turn 3, that means that they can then tap out next turn, play a good 4-drop or 2 2-drops. I don't hold that mana hostage, right? And that's the key with these kind of cards, these Lightblade style of cards. You get to hold the mana hostage if you're thinking about it. You get to go, yeah, you're not spending it this turn. I get to dictate when you get to spend it. And yes, of course, that means you're not getting it for damage, but that's an okay trade-off. I believe that, you don't need that many turns of attacking with all your creatures to actually close out the game. Sure, chip damage is nice, but the calculus I would make there is it is better to leave a little bit of damage on the table than it is to let them use their mana efficiently. I think letting the opponent use their mana efficiently is, I think, a mistake a lot of people make. And it's a hard one to not do because it's just very difficult to do all these steps of figuring out what they could have, figuring out if you can play around it, figuring out if they actually will waste their mana, right? Another thing is with counter spells. That's another example of thing like, okay, well, I could just pass here and make them waste their mana, or I could play into it and make them counter something I don't really want. It's that 2-step process there of identifying what they could have and then identifying what exactly you want to do about it. How do you best, how do you make your plays best line up in a way that makes life a little bit awkward for the opponent? So back to this game here, what I decided to do is not attack with the Ash for that exact reason. And I will also note that, okay, there's a Lightblades in their hand. I should think about that later. I should play around that later. So this Ash play, I think, is a good example of what I was talking about. Trying to suss out what it could mean when your opponent has open mana and play around it accordingly. Unfortunately, later in this game, or maybe fortunately for this podcast, because it's a great, back-to-back, oh, here's a good thing, here's a bad thing. Later in the game, I make the complete opposite play and make a terrible mistake here. So what happened here is we're on the later part of the game. This is turn 5, turn 6. The opponent's got 2 open mana. It's our turn. And the opponent's got a white up, and they have an unassuming Sage with the roll on it, so it's a 3/3. I've got 5 mana. I'm attacking into them with a Woodland Acolyte, so a 2/2, a Cheeky House Mouse, a 2/1, and of course in my hand I've got a Minecart Daredevil, the adventure creature that gives +2/+1 on attacks. I think, okay, this is fine. I get to trade up or trade off with their 3/3 and then play my Daredevil. But of course this is a terrible play because if on turn 2 I put them on Lightblades, then I shouldn't make this play here. And the key here for me, and this is something you can apply to all of your games, is don't put yourself in positions where you need to blink first in these spots. I've talked on previous gameplay podcasts about the concept of not blinking first, which is basically just to say, if you can force your opponent to act first, that's often better because then you can react to them. And in this spot, I'm letting my opponent do that. The reason I'm letting the opponent do that here is because I'm attacking 2/2 power creatures into a 3/3. I can't just let that happen. So this is just a bad attack that going back I wouldn't make because it forces me to cast the Daredevil, which then lets them respond, right? Because I can't just let my 2/1 die or my 2/2 die. It's just a bad attack. What I should have done here is just not attack, honestly. I don't want to put myself in that position where I have to go, well, I guess like if they have it, they have it. You know, you never want to say that. And especially it's so bad because I already said to myself, they had light blades this game, or it was likely they had light blades. And that's exactly what ended up happening. They had light blades. I got punished. I ended up winning the game, but it was really, really bad that happened. So if you are in combat and you need to cast a trick, especially an adventure trick, into open mana, maybe sometimes just don't make the attack, right? Ask yourself, hey, am I in a position where I can't afford to play around a removal spell, right? If I miss my window here, then my window's never going to be open again. You're just low to the ground aggro deck without a ton of impactful plays. You know, maybe you're not lucky, you don't have an Imidane's Recruiter to kind of push through the last points of damage. If you are that kind of deck and you're just on the cusp of dealing enough damage, or maybe the opponent stabilizing, sure, it's good to go for that. But I don't think I was in that spot at all. I think I had, a decent amount of things I could have done with my mana. And that's what it comes down to. If you can do something else with your mana, definitely think about doing something else rather than making this kind of attack, because you're just asking to get blown out here. And then I have another game here that I pulled from a coaching session that I did. So what's happening in this game is we are a blue-black, kind of, mid-range control-ish mid-range, not hard control. We do have a fair number of creatures that are attacking and blocking. We're playing a Tangled Colony, which is the 2-mana 3/2 rare that can't block. It's a purely aggressive card. So kind of mid-rangey blue-black with maybe slightly more control elements than not. And the opponent is on Mountain. That's all they've done. And we are on the draw, I believe. So they're on Mountain, and our hand is Picklock Prankster, Extraordinary Journey, which is the rare XX blue bounces stuff, Candy Grapple, Hatching Plans, and Tangled Colony, plus an island and a swamp. So basically, we have the decision here. We can either play out the Tangled Colony, get a little bit of a beatdown going on, or we could just hold up the Prankster's Adventure to go find a card, go find an instant sorcery or fairy, and hold up Candy Grapple at the same time. And if I was playing against an opponent who went like Forest, I would just play the Colony, start beating down, start getting in there. But because the opponent is on Mountain, well, that puts Torch the Tower in the range here, and I think it's really quite bad if I play the Colony on turn 2 here, and they just get to go 1-mana Torch. Once again, I want to make my opponent's life awkward. I want to make it so that they can't spend their mana efficiently. And since we're not like a beatdown aggro deck where we need to get on board, I don't think it's meaningfully worse to cast either Hatching Plans here or Picklock Prankster's Adventure. I think those are totally fine. So, because we're not pressured to get on board, we can kind of just play at our own pace. We have a little more controlling elements. And the opponent goes Mountain. Well, not only does that mean, okay, they could have Torch, of course, because they have a Mountain, but they kept a hand that didn't play a 2-drop and had Mountain in it. So what's going on there, right? So it's the combination of, even in the dark, I would just play, and we ended up playing the Picklock Prankster Adventure here, and we ended up doing some pretty good things in this game. They ended up having Torch the Tower eventually, if I remember correctly, so it would have been bad if we did play the Colony on turn 2, because they would have had a really good turn. So yeah, like in the dark versus a red deck, I would just cast the Prankster's Adventure here anyways instead of Colony, because it lines up so much better. But especially that added context, a little clue of, well, they kept a hand with Mountain and no 2 or 1-drop. Why would they do that? What does their hand look like to make this hand make sense? And of course, it ended up being Torch the Tower. It would have been pretty bad if we cast the Colony on 2. Like, not game ending by any means, but meaningfully worse. And there are some times where you make decisions like this that are actually game defining, where you played the wrong 2-drop on 2 or spent your mana the wrong way on turn 2. And it can be tough to see that when you go look back at your game, right? It's hard to see that had a ripple effect on the rest of how the game played out. Okay, now let's get into those archetype buckets that I was talking about, and talking about how the different types of decks play out in this format. And by the way, I'm talking about these archetype buckets, less so color pairs, because there's a lot of dynamic ways you can play the cards in this format. Like red-black could be red aggro with some black removal, or it could be like black attrition, a bunch of removal with some red removal in there as well. Just saying a red-black deck isn't as descriptive as putting them in these buckets. And the buckets that I'm talking about are 1, red aggro, 2, blue control, 3 kind of green, mid-rangey, maybe a bunch of colors, maybe just a green base, and 4 black, attrition, bunch removal, making the game go long. There's also the white decks, of course, and I've not really grouped them in here because I think the difference is that with the other colors, I think they're deep enough to have a base deck that's just formed around just commons of that color, even blue, which is kind of funny as the quote-unquote weakest color in this set, whereas white, there's just not a ton of commons. Like, you've got Hopeful Vigil, Stockpiling Celebrant, Cooped Up. Those are all good. Archon's Glory as well. And if you could get, like, 3 Vigils and 3 Stockpiling Celebrants every draft, sure. But that just doesn't happen very often, where with the other decks, I think there's just more interchangeable pieces. So I'm going to be talking about the white cards, certainly. But as far as the archetype buckets, it's just red aggro, blue control, green midrange, and black attrition. Okay, so let's start with red aggro. And anytime I talk about a new bucket of archetypes, I'm going to just talk a little bit about how the deck plays out and how you want to conceptualize these decks. This can be red-black, it can be red-white, it's a little bit less often red-green. I don't think the green cards play an aggressive game all that well, or at least there are very few ones that do, that lend themselves better to a purely aggressive game rather than a more mid-rangey or bigger game. And I think red-blue is almost always going to be a slower deck. I've had and seen base red decks that have blue cards in there for supporting. You know, they've got like some tempo cards in there, but I think that's a lot rarer than just base blue control. So when I'm talking red aggro, I'm mostly talking the Mardu color pairs and maybe an offshoot with green and blue sometimes. Whenever you are drafting an aggro deck, one of the most important questions you want to ask yourself is, how is this deck pushing damage? Sometimes the answer to that is the creatures just attack really well on their own. Sometimes the answer to that is you're pumping the team with a mass pump spell. Sometimes your answer is just, okay, I'm using removal spells and combat tricks to get in. But you do want to, as you're building your deck and drafting, understand what your main method of getting damage in. And I would say for these red aggro decks, like sometimes they just curve out and they kill you. You know, they go Embereth Veteran on one into Grand Ball Guest into Ratcatcher Trainee. Okay, that's a really, really good curve out. But other times, and I would say most frequently with these decks, I am looking to go wide and, you know, finish them off with a 9 crescendo or something like that. Ratcatcher Trainee plays a really big part here. So I think often, ideally what you're doing is you're going a little bit under the opponent. In typical red fashion, you're playing a 1, like with a Spear Guard or a Embereth Veteran if you can, playing a 2, playing a 3, and you're just backing up that early board presence you have with combat tricks and removal. And if you do have more Ratcatcher Trainees, or you're in red-black and have a few more Rat Makers, then you can do the whole go wide thing and put a 9 crescendo in. But I do think the plan of just play some stuff earlier than the opponent can and keep them off balance works just well. You know, just 1 into 2 into 3, keep them off balance with some combat tricks and some removal spells. But I do think it's really important to know what kind of aggro deck you are, either going wide, finishing off with 9 crescendo, or just like low to the ground, trying to get in with combat tricks and removal spells, because depending on which of those two styles of red aggro decks you are, that will change what you want to do in combat, right? Because if you're let's just say you're a black-red aggro deck, and you're not going wide, you don't have many Rat Makers, no 9 crescendo, I will make more aggressive attacks, which is to say attacks that sometimes have my creatures getting eaten by my opponent's creatures, or attacks that, you know, aren't great trades on face value, if it means I'll be able to put the opponent to like 2 or something. Because at that point, you know, maybe I have 2 Hopeless Nightmares in my deck, or 2 Flick of Coins or something, where putting them to a low life total will benefit me, because I really needed to get them down to 5 or whatever so I could finish them off. And if I didn't make those aggressive attacks, they would have just stonewalled me. And when I draw my burn, like, you know, my flicks or my Hopeless Nightmares, they're not going to be that effective, because if I did attack all, then I could draw my burn spells and then kill them. But because I didn't do that a little bit earlier, well, then I'm not set up for that. You don't want to do that, though, if you are a go wide aggro deck with 9 crescendo. You don't want to throw away your board, because when you draw your 9 crescendo, you're not going to have a board. So really, you're asking yourself, what am I hoping to accomplish with my attack? Am I hoping to put them in a low life total? Well, if you are, then you have to have burn in your deck to make that make sense. But if you're not doing that, there's no burn, there's no nightmares, and you've just got a wide board and a 9 crescendo somewhere, you just want to wait for that 9 crescendo. You don't want to throw away your board, make bad trades, and then you draw your 9 crescendo, it's not going to do anything. So let's get into some specific cards, starting with the aforementioned Ratcatcher Trainee, which is, of course, the 2-mana 2/1. First strike on your turn, has Pest Problem as the 3-mana adventure to make 2 rats at instant speed. So the big thing about this card and playing this card correctly is I think you should really try to avoid playing Ratcatcher on turn 2. And you should try to adventure it rather than playing it on turn 2. Even if you don't have another turn 2 play. The reason being that the 2 mana 2/1 first strike is really, really bad versus basically most decks. Like there are very few decks where it's not going to be bad against. Either your opponent is playing, this is the worst case scenario, they're playing black or red. So rat out, inflict a coin, make training a liability. Or they're playing blue or green, and green's got a 2 mana 1/3, the Fawn, and blue's got the Alchemist, which is a card that people are playing a lot more, the 2 mana 1/3 that gets +2 whenever you cast a spell, that just brick this. So really, it's only white that doesn't super punish trainee, and they're going to be playing white with another color most likely, so they're going to have some of those cards some amount of the time that punishes it. It's just not that effective at getting its job done, of just attacking, getting in damage, right? It needs some help. So instead, I think it's just better to cast Pest Problem, because like I mentioned, a lot of the red decks in this format are just winning by going wide. And that's the other thing too. If you are a deck that's going wide, you don't want to miss on the power of this card, which is 3 bodies on 1 card. That's a lot of power, power and toughness, but also, just like power. It's a powerful effect for the go wide plan. You don't want to give that up. And because you're looking to win in like a big burst of damage, not necessarily chip damage, getting them down to 4 points, then burning out or casting a combat trick on an unblocked creature, it doesn't matter that much that you miss out on the Ratcatcher damage on turn 2. It actually matters a little bit more, I believe, in these go wide decks that you have those 3 bodies. So I could see an argument for playing trainee in a deck on turn 2, playing trainee in a deck that doesn't have any go wide payoffs, right? You don't care about making the rats. You don't have anything that's like going to sacrifice the rats. You don't have anything that's going to pump the rats. You say, okay, my deck is winning a little bit more by the other kind of red deck I was talking about, where you're just getting under the opponent, casting removal spells, casting tricks. And that's a little more okay. If I look at my hand and my hand has like 2 Minecart Daredevils, and it means the trainee's going to be able to attack a little bit better, sure, I'm a little more likely to pay it on turn 2. But I believe my default, and I think your default should be too, just not to cast it on turn 2 if you can help it. Both because you get punished for doing it a lot of time, and you lose out on a lot of what makes this card good. Next up on our list of red cards is Harried Spear Guards. This is the 1 mana 1/1 haste that when it dies, you make a rat. I think this card is a little bit misunderstood in its role that it tries to play in the game. I hear a lot of people say, I don't like Spear Guard that much. It just dies when your opponent casts a 2-drop, you can't attack into it anymore. It gets in for a point. It's not that good. So that is true. But don't see that as a failing of the card necessarily. The reason you play Spear Guard is, well, number one, if you can have that sick 1, 2, 3 backup with removal spell and combat trick starts, it's going to be really, really good still. It's going to get in for a point or 2, and then it's going to just contribute to you going, just attacking for 6 points a turn if you can clear the board. But also in the go wide plan, like I kind of just described what you want in the cast a bunch, get under them and cast removal spells and tricks red deck. But in the go wide deck, what Spear Guard does is kind of the same thing. It gets in for a point or 2, but then it's this creature that you're okay attacking with all of your creatures, and if they want to eat this thing, that's okay, because you are left with the same amount of power attacking the next turn, right? When you have a go wide deck, often the thing you're thinking about is, how many turns in a row can my board attack and be profitable? And by be profitable, I mean you're getting in enough damage for the number of creatures you're losing. Often you're going to be attacking with a bunch of 1/1s, all these rats and Spear Guards, and you say, okay, they've got 1 creature, maybe 2 creatures, I can kill one of them and attack with my 5 1/1s here, and that's good enough because they're at 12, I'll deal them 4 points, I'm cool trading off a rat for 4 points of damage. Well, with Spear Guard, if they choose to block this, then you attack you attack with 5 rats and they block this, you're going to attack with 5 rats again next turn, 5 1/1s. And of course, they can just block a rat instead. But the Spear Guard means the Spear Guard's good to getting in, and it's something that they don't actually want to block. So it's less so like, oh, this thing's going to keep attacking over and over and over again and getting in because it's so big. It's not, of course, it's just a 1/1. But it does help that go wide plan by giving you something that you really don't mind just sending in. You probably also had spots where it's like, well, this Spear Guard doesn't actually have a very good attack at all, but I have these 2 5/5s attacking, and hey, if they want to eat my Spear Guard instead of double blocking one of my 5/5s, that's okay too, right? So it does get in. It has evasion in kind of a sneaky way. You wouldn't think it gets in, but it actually gets in a little bit more. So from a gameplay perspective, what that means basically is just consider this kind of a creature that's going to sit there, and once your board is gone wide a little bit, you start attacking, and it can keep doing its thing. Don't think of this as like, oh, okay, I got him for a few points, and now it's done. Also, don't just block with it early, right? I've seen some people be like, all right, they feel like their Spear Guard's got him for a point, and that's it. It's not going to do much else. They block, like they chump block a 3/3 or something. I wouldn't do that, because then you lose that on that, attacking multiple turns with a bunch of creatures. Also works very well if you just have multiple Spear Guards, right? Because it's like, same thing. You keep attacking for 3 your turn, even if they block some of your stuff. Next up, one thing that has tripped me up less and less as the format's gone on, but definitely got some getting used to as I was playing this format, is just the slightly different timings on the celebration cards. So, Grand Ball Guest just gets +1/+1 as long as you have celebration, which means that in combat you can cast your Ratcatcher Training Adventure, make 2 rats, and you get to pump the Grand Ball Guest. You can kind of use it as a combat trick. That doesn't work for Ash Party Crasher, because Ash says when this attacks, you get a counter if you have celebration. Okay, so that is one thing. But then Belligerent of the Ball, which is the 3-mana 3/3 celebration that gives something +1/+0 and menace, that's a different thing. That's in a beginning of combat trigger, so just be careful about that. And then there's Picnic Ruiner, which has a while I'm attacking triggers. That's a little bit different too. But the point here is just really read your red cards, make sure you know when they actually trigger. I've seen people lose the game because I think they expected their Belligerent of the Ball to trigger during combat, and it just didn't. Next up, we've got the story of the format here, Imidane's Recruiter, which I don't think I need to read out, but it is the 3-mana 2/2 that pumps your team and then has the Train Troops adventure to put 2/2 white Vigilant Night creature tokens on the battlefield. Not too much to say, nothing too complex. All I want to say is don't be afraid to run out Imidane's Recruiter, just the red side on turn 3, especially if you have one of those 1-drop into 2-drop into 3-drop starts and just have that nice little curve out. Maybe the opponent's not interacting that much and you're just like, yeah, just getcha. I will also be more likely to just run it out if I'm splashing the white side. Like I'm a black-red deck that has some treasure and maybe Evolving Wilds or something. It's just not that likely that when I get to turn 5, if I don't already have that mana in hand, that I'm going to be able to train troops. So I'll just be more likely to run it out if I'm not red-white. But I do think if you are red-white and you can consistently go 5 into Recruiter, maybe something else on 6, that is a more powerful thing to do. So this is mostly just giving you permission, putting it in your range of sometimes you do cast it on turn 3 if you don't think you're going to be able to cast it on turn 5, or if you just have a really good beatdown going and you just want to, keep the pressure on. Next up, we've got kind of a funny card. This is Witch's Mark, which is a card that's not exclusive to red aggro, but I do play it in my red aggro decks. This is the red 2-mana, discard a card, and if you do draw 2 cards, create a Wicked Roll token attached to up to 1 target creature you control. So the templating on this card causes some issues. So number 1, it's templated a bit different than most Tormenting Voice or Thrill possibilities, where you don't actually have to discard the card before you cast it, which is a big deal, because if this gets countered, you would still need to discard the card on those other versions. Not true for this. You wait till it resolves first, and then you discard. But the bigger thing is that this card targets, which means that if a target disappears as you're casting it, if they kill your creature that you're giving the Wicked Roll to, you don't get to resolve the draw 2 effect. So if you really, really need that draw 2 effect and can't afford for this to get countered, don't target one of your creatures for value. Like, there are spots where I've just gone, you know what? I can't afford for this to not work. I need to dig to some action. Yes, I miss out on a point of damage or a point of power here and there, but they've just had open mana forever. I really can't afford to, so just be careful about that. And one last thing to think about when talking about these red aggro decks is that concept of not blinking first, forcing your opponent to react to you rather than the opposite way around. You don't want to cast your Minecart Daredevils into open mana, like I mentioned before. But that applies to combat tricks like Archon's Glory. It applies to something like Conceited Witch, where your sorcery speed putting a roll on something. Only do that when your opponent doesn't have mana open, or at the very least is tapped down. Like, if they've got 1 mana up, okay, you're gonna have to weigh, well, it's a red mana and they have Torch, they could really get me, but, they haven't, again, you go through that whole thing of like, well, they haven't really been playing like they had a Torch, so maybe it's okay. But you want to be able to make your opponent tap out so that you can then use your tricks, use these sorcery speed rolls in a way that it doesn't open you up to getting blown out. And so, because you want to put your opponent in that spot, it's so important to have a low curve, right? Like, obviously, aggro decks have a low curve. That's just generally a truth. But when I say a low curve, I do mean as many 1s and 2s as you can. because you really want to have that getting under them effect where they have to respond to you. You don't get under them if you're on the draw and they have a 2-drop. Your first thing is a 2-drop, right? If you're on the draw, you really want to be playing a 1-drop. And it's hard to get under them on the draw anyways, but it's really, really bad if your hand is a bunch of things that you have to blink first for, like Archon's Glory, like Conceited Witch, all these things, when you're not already on board, right? So the fix for this is as many cheap things as possible, so your opponent is forced to tap out to either kill a creature in combat so that they don't take additional damage, or play a blocker, and then your tricks become more effective. All of these cards that are good in the aggro decks, these rolls, these tricks, these adventure cards, get so much worse if you can't get on board early. So just something to keep in mind. Taking a trip down to the other end of the spectrum here, and I've got blue control. And blue has been one of my most played colors recently. I've really come around to it, partially because I really think I've cracked it and I understand how to play it now, but also because people do tend to avoid the blue cards. So when you're playing a blue control game, the basic plan, the most basic plan is interact as much as you can early, and then cast some number of draw 3 effects. So whether that be into the Fate Court or sacrificing your hatching plans, the blue decks really are able to just truly outcard your opponent. You know, that's the way you're winning. You're just up on a million cards on them. But to get to that point where you can cast your into the Fate Court, hatching plans is obviously a little bit easier because you can just cast a bargain removal spell and bargain it away. That's why that card's so good. But to get to that point, you have to be stable. So you have to be interacting early with your cheap interaction spells, your counter spells. Those are, kind of interchangeable as far as their role they play early in the game, so that you can just deal with the cheap creatures, deal with the cheap things your opponent plays. And then hopefully by turn 5, you aren't under that much pressure. You're at like 18 still, cast into the Fate Court, and you've killed other stuff. You won for 1, and now you're up 3 cards, right? So that's kind of the general idea. And that core can be applied to basically all the color combinations. It's much better in black-red or blue-black because you get the good cheap interaction, but white plays pretty well with that too because you've got the, Cooped Up, and you've got Princess Takes Flight, which plays well with the blue bargain stuff going on. So that's just your generalized plan that can fit into most of the color combinations. And if you just play with that plan in mind, interact a bunch early, and when I say interact, I don't mean just play blockers. That's good if that's the only thing you can do, but really, you want to be interacting as in, like, reaching out, casting a removal spell so that you leave your opponent with, like, combat tricks stranded in hand. That's ideal. So that's Blue's general game plan. And if you're not doing that, I'm not really sure what you're doing. I really feel that it's all about just interact early and then outcard them. That being said, one of the most important cards in that plan is Into the Fate Court, which is the 5-mana draw 3, make a 1/1 flyer that can only block creatures with flying. And this card is a common way to facilitate that game plan I was just talking about. I aim for 2 of these draw 3 effects generally, whether it be 2 Into the Fate Courts or ideally 2 hatching plans, but any combo of that is good. And the key to Into the Fate Court, kind of like I was alluding to a second ago, is you want to cast it as soon as you can, where you don't take like 5 or 6 damage after you cast it, right? If your opponent's got a board and you cast it and they attack you for 6 on the turn you cast it, well, your Fate Court had this really bad line of text on it, basically. It dealt you a bunch of damage. But if you can find a spot that you can just resolve it, and I would do that above playing a creature, for example. Like, that's the distinction I think it would make here for just a good gameplay tip. You just want to find that window that you can resolve, because it's just not easy to find a window to resolve a 5-mana sorcery that doesn't affect the board. You want to be interacting early. You want to be making sure that you're not taking additional chip damage early. And the moment that you have that window, maybe you take, maybe they're attacking you with a 2/2 or something, that's okay. Just cast this card. Because then, not only do you get this card out of your hand, which is kind of like this big hump that you have to get over when playing these blue decks, but also you just have way more options the turn after, which is obviously awesome. Next up, talking about said counter spells here, Ice Out and Spell Stutter. So, Ice Out is important for these decks. I do really want to pick up a copy or 2, maybe 3 in some decks if I'm pretty bargain heavy, or bargain fodder heavy, I should say. Spell Stutter, I've found, is mostly just a blue-black card. I don't think you want to play it unless you have fairies. And sometimes you're like blue-white and you have, a few fairies in there. But you don't want to play this card without, I would say, minimum 2 or 3 fairies. Ice Out's just good, though. Ice Out you can play. And funny enough, Ice Out has, I think, probably the biggest delta of how well the card performs in the hands of a good player compared to the hands of, a medium, intermediate, or not so good player. This was one of the things that when 17 lands first came out, I remember watching one of Ham TV, Kyle Rose's streams, and people were asking him, what do you think about the 17 lands? Like, how do you think it's gonna revolutionize how we look at draft? How much do you want to trust the stats? Like, do you think this is reputable and credible looking at this information? And Ham basically said, the stats are the stats. The numbers are the numbers. And, so there's going to be some cards that are winning, and I'm paraphrasing very much here. But he used the example of a counter spell. And he said, I don't think that 17 lands is that helpful for me. Because when I look and see how well a counterspell is doing, which is, traditionally a pretty difficult card to use right, and find the timing and know when to tap out or when not to, know when to leave up your counterspell. He's like, I'm going to be able to use a counterspell much, much better than somebody else. And I think that's very true. A good player is going to be able to use a counterspell, know all those balance of the things you have to get right that I just mentioned. And that plays out in the data actually on 17 lands right now, because Ice Out's one of the best commons among top players, and not a very good common at all among the other players. So really what this says to me is Ice Out is really difficult to play. Our counterspells in general are tough to play for the majority of players. I don't think I have a clear answer. There's no clear, like, hey, here's the secret to playing counterspells. But one piece of advice I could give if you're somebody who doesn't have much experience with playing counterspells, or feel like you never really quite get it right, is be picky about where you use your counterspell later in the game, but just cast it on turn 3 to counter their 3-drop. And I think people actually swap that. I think that's why people mostly don't do that well with Ice Out if they're not used to counterspells. They are picky about what they counter early, and they're not that picky about what they counter late. So the idea here is that when you have Ice Out in your opening hand and you pass the turn, they play a 3-drop, you kind of just have to keep pace with them. You kind of just have to counter their spell. You kind of just have to be like, okay, sure. Like, so I'm not getting the most exciting thing. I'm countering a Sweet Tooth Witch or maybe a Conceited Witch or something. But you know what? Like I just mentioned with these blue decks, I'm interacting early. That's kind of what you want to do. You can't be too picky about it. You might think, I want to save this counter spell for their bomb. They're a great thing. But you just have to kind of cast it on curve keep pace. But later in the game, what I've observed is people just kind of fire off their counterspell at a pretty good thing. You want to be really, really careful about where you're using your counterspell later in the game, because it's the catch-all answer to anything you can't answer. If my opponent resolves a pretty good spell, let's say it's a Gingerbread Hunter, right? I'm going to be like, all right, like I could counter this, but I have blockers for this thing. This thing's not getting it. It's not that big of a deal. I'd much rather Ice Out when they go for a combat trick, when they attack with that Gingerbread Hunter, or cast a spell that I can't deal with, something with a good enter the battlefield effect. So that's like the quick and dirty rundown of counter spells. Be picky about what you're countering later, and don't be picky early. I think that solves a lot of the problems, because usually when a card has really poor stats, or I should say one of the reasons a card might have poor stats is it's a card that tricks people into keeping it in their hand longer than they should. Maybe it has a kicker cost that people really want to play, or it's a card that they're looking for the perfect moment to cast, kind of like I'm talking about this Ice Out here, but they should just cast it. Cast their cheap removal spell on the 2-drop instead of just waiting for something else, something more exciting. Maybe the opponent cast an oof, and they're like, I don't really want to torch the tower this thing, but it's like, nah, you just should. So Ice Out definitely has a lot of that going on, where people keep it in their hand too long, and effectively it makes it a dead card if they're not going to cast it, right? So yeah, that is my quick and dirty rundown of how to play counter spells, and I'm sure I could talk more about this on a future episode. If you're interested in it, please let me know. But yeah, do play Ice Out. I do think it's important for these blue control decks. I think it's a really good tool to have. Moving on to another blue card here, Diminisher Witch, although I'm not specifically talking about Diminisher Witch, more about cursed rolls in general. So cursed rolls have, I would say, disappointed for most people. I think a lot of people went into the set being like, oh, cursed roll seems, at least pretty solid. And it's kind of been, I would say, the worst roll overall. But there are kind of a few things that you can do when you have cursed rolls that I think do make them a little bit better than people give them credit for. And the main one is finishing a creature off with a cursed roll. So an example of this is you have your opponent has a 2/3 flyer on the battlefield, maybe a Tune Veil Guide. You've got 2 Barrow Naughties, right? And you're attacking on turn 4. And what you can do in that spot is attack with the 2 Barrow Naughties. They're almost certainly going to block. And then you can post-combat cast, let's say, a Diminisher Witch, bargain it, and then you get to put the curse roll on your opponent's 2/3 flyer it's now a 1/1 with 1 damage mark, so it's going to die. So any creature that has gotten into combat, has had a damage dealt to it, will die to a cursed roll. So that's how you can kind of use it as a removal spell. And then the other thing, of course, too, is that these cursed rolls get a little bit better if your deck is full with the X1 hate effects. If you have Flick a Coin, Rat Out, the Otter, or the Shrouded Shepherd, then you can kind of combo those, right? It's not the most efficient thing in the world, but, you know, to kill a Hamlet Glutton, you're going to do what you have to do. Next up, just a quick note on a card, Bitter Chill. This is the 1 in a blue uncommon aura that ETBs taps a creature. That creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step, and then when Bitter Chill is put into the graveyard, you can pay 1, and if you do, scry 1, draw a card. I think people, including myself, I definitely have not done this when you gotten the chance to, and should have. I think people sometimes forget that you can bargain this thing away, right? You put this on their 2-drop just to not take early damage, and then that 2-drop's not that big of a deal later. All right, well, bargain away, pay a mana, get your card back. I think we often think of this as like insurance if they go to sacrifice the card or if they pick it up with a stockpiling Celebrant, but you can actually also use it proactively. Or if you have a Field Wipe in your deck, not going to be that common, but just remember that you might want to wait one more turn. Like let's say you have an Expel the Interlopers. You might want to wait till turn 6 so you can cast your Expel, also pay the 1 for the Bitter Chill to get your card back. Next up is Aquatic Alchemist, and I've really been liking Aquatic Alchemist lately. So this is the 2-mana 1/3 in blue that gets pumped if you cast an instant or sorcery, and it's got the adventure to put a spell on top of your library. So this is just one of blue's only good cheap creatures. Blue just doesn't have a lot of good cheap creatures, and you can't get all the premium removal you want in the world. So you're going to play some amount of Aquatic Alchemist, and I've been pretty happy, especially when you've got Rat Outs or Archon's Glory, just any 1 mana or just very cheap spell that does make it so it is a meaningful blocker. But also, the great part is this is also a good 2-drop in the late game because Blue's main plan of outcard you, well, this plays pretty well if you can top one of your Into the Fate Courts or one of your better spells. Or sometimes you're just like, all right, my next draw is going to be a removal spell, right? I just want to put my Candy Grapple back. The other thing I'll do is, in the late game when I'm already kind of far ahead, I'll top a Ice Out, right? I had a few blue control decks on stream this week, and very often the play pattern was, all right, well, we just top this, use Alchemist to top this counterspell, this Ice Out, and that'll probably just lock up the game, because the opponent needed, you know, 1 more way to push damage or 1 removal spell, and if I just have the counter spell, then that's just not going to happen. So I really like Alchemist. This is actually a little bit more just talking about the card rather than the gameplay, because this is not a card I've gotten to shout out before, and I did want to give it some credit in the blue control section here. So yeah, play your Alchemist. They play pretty well if you're prioritizing the right cards. The last card to talk about for the blue control plan is Balluna's Gatekeeper. So this is the 6-mana 6/5 that has the 2-mana bounce spell as the adventure. This card I have seen a lot of people just cast on turn 2 just to bounce a 2-drop. And like, that's not the absolute worst thing in the world if you need to. It's not ideal. And generally, I like trying to hold this for a token creature, because it's so much better if you can kill their Hopeful Vigil creature or even just a rat, right? Like, killing a rat's not that bad with this. I do think that if you absolutely have to, just keep them off balance. Sure, bounce their 2-drop. But I hold my Gatekeepers a little bit longer than I think a lot of people do. Just because it does really make a meaningful difference when you actually kill something with this rather than just return to your opponent's hand. As a control deck, fundamentally, you want to be trading 1 for 1 on resources and then gassing up at some point. This trades 0 for 1. Well, not quite 0 for 1 because you're going to draw the Gatekeeper, so that makes it kind of okay. But if you can turn your Gatekeeper into a kind of a Flame Tongue Kavu in some ways, that makes it a lot better. So this isn't like you should never, I was talking about the Rat Catcher training here. You should never play it on turn 2, or very, very rarely. I don't feel like it's that. It's just more of a push to say, if you got other stuff to do, consider holding it. Next up, we've got our black Attrition decks. So these decks are sort of like the blue control decks in their main game plan, was just to stay alive and outgrind you. They're doing it a little bit differently because instead of the game plan of going cast a bunch of removal and then cast your draw 3, it's a little bit more black-based with cast removal spells, and you're not outcarding the opponent by drawing 3, but every card you play, or most cards you play, give you a little something extra, right? Rat Up gives you that rat. Sweet Tooth Witch gives you a food. There's Conceit Witch gives you a roll. Shadow the Source gives you a roll. Like, a lot of these black cards are very good at generating this other permanent that you can then use to bargain away. So it's basically a game plan where every spell you cast is just going to give you a little bit of something, and that adds up to outcarding your opponent at some point. That being said, no better place to start than some black removal spells, specifically Candy Grapple and Rat Out. And the thing I want to say about these cards is, especially because they are damage based, they care if your opponent, if your opponent casts a combat trick, they can counter them effectively. You really want to ask yourself on your turn, before you pass the turn, what are the pros and cons of casting a removal spell on your turn versus on your opponent's turn, giving it back to them, letting them untap with their mana. And there are pros and cons on both sides. The pro for waiting is, well, maybe you're not under that much pressure and you don't actually want to kill the 2-drop they have and you kill their 3-drop instead with the Candy Grapple. That's a reason to wait. Or maybe you've got a board, the game's gone on for a little bit, you've got a bit of a board, they've got a bit of a board, and you think they're going to attack you. Well, holding up the Candy Grapple to respond to a trick is a really big deal. Certainly an advantage there. If you've got counter spells in hand, there's obviously you want to not just tap out on your turn. But conversely, if none of those things are true, you don't really have a board, and you kind of just have to kill the thing, just go for it, right? You don't gain that much by waiting. Your opponent's not randomly going to put an aura on their creature. Maybe they put a roll on their creature, and you can get them there. But I think against any good opponent, they're not just going to jam into your open mana. So if you do think you have a reason to hold these cards up and not just cast them on your turn, you have a tangible advantage to gain, then sure, definitely you can make that argument. But I do really want to highlight that I think like 50% of the time, I'm just casting these cards on my turn. I guess another thing is the more room for error you have, the more you can wait and hold it for your opponent's turn. The more you're just getting beaten down, you're like, geez, I just have to kill these things. The more you should just cast in your turn because it's like such a disaster if things go wrong. So there aren't actually a ton of cards I wanted to talk about for this Black Attrition strategy. Not many I pulled aside. But I did want to talk about Scream Puff. This is the 5-mana 4/5 Death Touch, so when it deals damage to a player, you make a food token. I really like Scream Puff in these Black Attrition decks. It really, once you've run your opponent out of resources, you've cast some removal spells, they don't have blockers, maybe you've played some early creatures that they decide to interact with, Scream Puff just comes down and they really can't block it very well, and if they don't have a removal spell, this thing's just going to kill them. So what I do with Scream Puff is I tend to kind of treat it as a bomb. Not in the way that it's like, oh, it's like the best card in my deck, but in the way that I will try to tease out my opponent's removal beforehand. Because if the opponent doesn't have a good answer for this, like a point-and-click removal spell, it's a really big problem. I mean, you do a very good job of getting to a game state where your opponent does think the Scream Puff is a big problem, because if you do get to grind out their resources and leave them with not much, it's not easy to deal with this card in combat. So I would play my other stuff first. I mean, obviously, if you have some creature that's better than Scream Puff, then maybe Scream Puff can be the one that's kind of dangling out there, enticing your opponent to cast a removal spell. But I will try to maybe even sometimes induce my opponent into like casting a removal spell. I make a kind of awkward double block that, maybe I don't care about the creatures that much, but I block 2/2/2s on their 3/3, and that might make them go, okay, well, I'll just use my Candy Grapple here to win the combat. And then, Scream Puff comes down and kind of dominates them from there. So be careful with the Scream Puffs. It's not the worst if you want to just jam it on turn 5, especially if you have more of a proactive draw. But I think the more time you can have to just kind of make it so you grind down your opponent's resources, the better it is for resolving the Scream Puff. And that brings us to our last big bucket of archetypes here, and that's green multicolor. So this is, I think, another, just like red aggro, one of the staples of the format. I think people have maybe had a little bit less experience with Black Attrition, a little bit less experience with blue control, but the green multicolor stuff seems to be pretty straightforward. People draft this quite a bit. My main gameplay thought about these decks are how they're positioned against the other decks in the format, which is mostly they are the mid-range deck of the format. You're this deck that's just trying to cast a bunch of powerful cards, maybe have some ramp in there, some card draw, some removal, and that kind of deck is going to be the control versus your aggro decks, the red aggro decks we talked about. But against the blue decks, I do think you're supposed to take the beatdown role, because they will outcard you. I mentioned blue's main plan is just to go up 3 or 6 cards on you. And sure, you can be casting a bunch of great cards, but if your opponent's countering them and interacting, it's just not going to matter because your opponent's just going to draw 3 a bunch. So you do need to be the beatdown in those controlling matchups. And as you're playing, and very soon as you get into the game, you should be able to decide what you're supposed to be doing, taking that beatdown role or that more controlling role. And that will affect what you're going to play, right? Maybe if you were playing a blue deck, instead of casting a low-impact ramp spell like Return from the Wilds on turn 3, you cast a creature instead to start beating down. So that's the thing I'm thinking about with the green decks. What are my cards doing in this matchup? And sometimes it's unfortunate you don't have a hand that can really pressure well against the control decks, or you're just a little bit too slow against the aggro decks. Kind of one of the perils of a mid-range deck in general. But if you can make some more informed decisions based on what you think your opponent's doing, that'll really benefit you, I think. All right, so let's close her down by talking about some green cards here. Starting with Brave the Wild, single green mana. You get a land from your deck, and if you've bargained it, you can make one of your lands do a 3/3 haste. Pretty simple thing here is just don't always cast this on turn 1. If you have an opening hand of 3 or 4 lands, and maybe your curve's pretty low, I do think that the upside of turning this into a 3/3 is pretty big. So I don't just default to casting this on turn 1. And I think it can be very easy to autopilot doing that. There are some times when you're going to be like, I'm going to hold it, and it actually punishes you because you're like, I would have preferred this land to come untapped on turn 5 or whatever. But I do think that risk reward is something you're going to weigh every game that you play. And with this card, I've more and more seen this as the first part of the card and less so the second part. I really do want to be making a creature with this, and I'll cast this if I need to early in the game. But it's not my default anymore. My default is actually holding the Brave until you can actually make that 3/3. Hamlet Glutton, the big boy here. 7 mana, 6/6. You can bargain it. Costs 2 less. Gains 3 life when it enters as trample. So my thoughts on Hamlet Glutton are actually very similar to my thoughts on Scream Puff. I've had a lot of my Hamlet Gluttons just die. Right, because my early game is, alright, play a defensive 2-drop, and then maybe a ramp spell, and then I cast my Glutton and get scooped up. Because very classic fashion, your opponent didn't have a good target for the removal spell earlier. First thing you play is going to probably die. So you kind of want to play your Hamlet Gluttons in the same sort of way as you would Scream Puff, where if you can, entice your opponent into casting a removal spell. A good comment that actually asks your opponent to interact with it is Hauled Scavenger, the 3/2 that has the adventure to make a food. That's something that your opponent could very reasonably cast a removal spell on. So if you can really tease out that removal with one of those cards first, it's great. And again, this is something that's a little more, like, if you can help it. Of course, if Hamlet Glutton is the best thing you think is to do on that turn, you just still cast it. But if you have other things to do, I'm not just turboing out Hamlet Glutton and hope it sticks, because very often it doesn't stick. Next card up is a pretty straightforward one. This is Curse of the Werefox. This is the 3 mana fight spell that comes with a monster roll. And this one's kind of funny. It's sort of like Ice Out, where it performs pretty well for the good players and really poorly in the hands of the medium and not so great players. That says to me that people are casting their curses into open mana a lot of the time. Kind of the theme of today is don't cast your things into open mana if you can help it. And Curse is one of the trickier ones because it's 3 mana. It's hard to fit it. It usually casts, it usually takes most of your turn. As premium removal has gotten better and better over the years, these fight effects have just gotten worse and worse, and it's just, we're seeing that in full force in this set, I think, where, yeah, you just, lose the game on the spot if you choose to cast this at the wrong time. So, not an unplayable card by any means, but really pick your spots for it. Then we have a Welcome to Sweet Tooth, which is the saga that makes a 1/1 and then a food, and then puts some counters on a creature equal to the number of foods you control +1. Just a very small note on this card is you want to try to spread out your threats if you can. So, the way this often plays out is, you make the 1/1, and maybe you play something else, and then you play a Ginger Brute, and you're like, okay, where do I put my 3 counters on? And you're like, oh, great, I can put it on this Ginger Brute. Well, you might not want to do that just in the beginning of the game, because often your opponent's going to be able to nab that with their first removal spell, but especially if they have open mana, right? You don't want to lose the counters, not even getting 1 hit. So what I would do instead is put the counters on that 1/1. Yes, it's not going to be as good of a threat, but a 4/4 or 5/5 is still pretty good. And then you have the Ginger Brute to peck in as well. So that's just a good example. I feel like often people try to load up on their best thing. It's like, oh, but this is my flyer, because then it's a gigantic flyer. When that flyer probably had a removal spell's name on it anyways. So you're kind of just giving your opponent a little bit of bonus value. You're doing them a favor. Try to spread out your threats if you can. And then our final card is just a don't make this silly mistake kind of card. Stormkeld Vanguard, which is the 6 mana 6/7 that can't be blocked by creatures power 2 or less, and has Bear Down, the sorcery adventure, which is a naturalize. Yeah, do not cast this on a treasure or a food when your opponent has open mana, because they can just fizzle it. I know that is pretty straightforward if you think about it, but I've had more opponents I would have expected fall for that. They cast it on my treasure, and I just go, all right, 0 mana, counter your Stormkeld Vanguard, so don't fall into that. So hopefully, this last point here will just save you a game once in a while where you might have thought it was a good idea to do that. And that's going to do it. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Not exactly sure where we're going next week. We do have the next set, Ixalan, coming out in about a month. So we got some time in there. We might do a broad level up. We might go a little bit deeper on WoW. Might have a guest on. Still a mystery to me. So stay tuned and we'll figure it out. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.